The great Polish dissident Jacek Kuron told me the story of when they were negotiating with the Polish party state. The leaders of Solidarity were negotiating what eventually became the transition to democracy, and conversation turned to the media, and a senior party official said, "We would rather give you the riot police than give you television." And he was absolutely right. Television was much more important, and in fact, in all these velvet revolutions and transitions, the moment when television gave coverage to the opposition was the point of no return. Media are crucial. They were crucial to preserving authoritarian and totalitarian systems in power. They were crucial to the transitions from those systems, and alas, they are now crucial to movement the other way, to the erosion of liberal democracy. If you ask why the erosion of liberal democracy is farther advanced in Viktor Orban's Hungary than in Poland, in my view, one of the key reasons is that Orban has really got the media under control. In Poland, state television is again a proper propaganda organ of the ruling party. But fortunately, there are other television channels, including a very important one called TVN, which is American-owned, and is, so to speak, MSNBC to the ruling party's Fox News. Now, Orban doesn't control the media by anything so old-fashioned and 20th century as censorship. Heaven forbid. Far too antiquarian. He controls it by ownership. What you do is you have the owners of what looks like a wonderfully plural media landscape who just happen to be your cronies, who you reward with government contracts and, by the way, with EU structural funds. That's how you control media in the 21st century. So media, alas, is absolutely crucial to the battle against resurgent illiberalism. Second point, if we're talking about journalism, we need to talk about journalists. What's happening to journalists in these struggles? They're being abused, attacked, threatened, imprisoned, kidnapped, and murdered. In Slovakia, a very brave investigative journalist was brutally murdered. In Bulgaria, we've just had another murder. We mentioned the Reuters correspondents in Myanmar. We mentioned, of course, Jamal Khashoggi, we still hope for the best, now being defended by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, that great friend of journalists, such a great friend of journalists that he's actually imprisoned more journalists than any other country in Turkey. So I hope we'll talk about journalists as well as journalism. And of course, then we'll talk about the internet. And on the internet, I just want to say in introduction one thing, which is we are in danger of having a mood swing from the cyber optimism and even utopianism of the 1990s and 2000s to a cyber pessimism and even fatalism today. Remember the glorious 1990s when the internet would set everyone free, and Facebook and Twitter revolutions would overthrow dictators across the world. And President Bill Clinton said for China to try to control the internet would be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. The Chinese Communist Party turned round and said, just watch us. And I would argue that the Chinese Communist Party has made a pretty effective stab at nailing Jell-O to the wall over the last 15 years, reasserting the sovereignty of the territorial state, not at all regardless of frontiers, right? Although only, as a Harvard University study, I think, plausibly argued, by building the largest apparatus of censorship in human history, because there's simply so much more speech you have to control. And as Secretary Clinton said, by building an apparatus of surveillance and control through the internet beyond a Stasi general's wildest dreams. And so now the whole discourse is about all the horsemen of the apocalypse and all the devils in hell coming from the internet. Russian disinformation, fake news, misinformation from Macedonian meme farms, hate speech, harassment, hyperpolarization, echo chambers, filter bubbles. I hope in this conversation we can actually take that apart analytically and see what is actually true in that and what is not. But the essential point is this: the internet of itself does not set anyone free. People set people free. The internet of itself does not enslave anyone. People enslave other people. Like all technologies, the internet is double-edged. And I'm very glad that Cato Regan has given us a brief of talking about strategies. Because what we need to talk about is strategies for maximizing, for using the liberating possibilities of the internet, which are still very much there, and minimizing and controlling the oppressive possibilities of the internet. I think that should be one of our great subjects. Now, to discuss this, we have a terrific panel. You have their biographies in the folder, so I'll be very brief. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak initially. Rasmus Nielsen is the newly crowned director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism here at Oxford. Nick Dawes is head of media at Human Rights Watch and has his own long history as a professional journalist in South Africa and India. Soma Basu is an Indian journalist, visiting fellow at the Reuters Institute, and runs this very interesting website to use the possibilities of the internet, precisely, to get out there stories that are not being covered sufficiently in the rest of the media. And finally, Ezgi Basharan is, may I say, a journalist in exile in Oxford, my colleague at St. Antony's, but was editor of one of the bravest independent newspapers in Turkey. They're going to talk in that order. Rasmus and Nick more in terms of an overview, Soma and Ezgi more in reports from the front line. They're each going to talk from 5 to a maximum of 7 minutes. I have the universally recognized yellow card in case they go over 7 minutes. Then we'll have a bit of discussion, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion with the audience. Rasmus.
Thanks very much, Timothy, for the introduction and for this opportunity. I think as Secretary Clinton outlined, it behooves us to recognize the political context of journalism today before we talk about technology and the profession itself, which is that we face a situation in which there is little short of a war on journalism perpetrated by political actors from the very top of many countries that we would all recognize as totalitarian or authoritarian, but also sometimes people that we, at least not so long ago, considered liberal democracies. Timothy gave some of the examples. We all know of examples from beyond the countries that profess to be democracies, but also within the European Union itself. We've had, in the last year, 3 investigative journalists, all murdered, all arguably because of their investigations of misuse of public funds and the nexus between private enterprise and politics in European Union member states that are in principle committed to the Charter of Fundamental Rights and to the protection of the words of journalists. I don't want to in any way equate that kind of brutal repression of journalism that we see even within the European Union with the lower level chicanery and pressure we see from other politicians take the form of words and harassment rather than actual violence. But I think it is worth recognizing also that even in countries where the elite has not joined in this war on journalism, that there is very direct and aggressive political pressure on journalism and the idea of independent journalism, including in this country, where the leader of the opposition in August compared much of the existing media in the UK, with its many imperfections, to fake news. That is, I think, indicative of the level of elite disregard, even contempt, for actually existing journalism, even in liberal democracies. That's the political context. There are, of course, also 2 other things going on at the same time. One is around technology. It's worth recognizing, again, very briefly, that the ways in which people get their news has been fundamentally transformed in the last 10 years. By now, in countries where income or deep inequality is not a barrier, more than half of media use is digital. Of that use, more than half of the population will say that they prefer to get their news indirectly via entities like search engines and social media rather than going direct to news providers themselves. And of all that digital media use, more than half takes place on mobile devices. This is a fundamental transformation in the infrastructure of free expression. It's happened over less than 10 years. It is at least as profound as the rise of television, and might well be said to be as profound as the rise of printing press in early modern Europe. That's the technology. And then, of course, finally, the public. I mean, journalism exists in the context of its audience, whether you think about its political importance, its public impact, or for that matter, its legitimacy and ultimately its business models. And we have to recognize that much of the public right now does not think very highly of journalism. It is not rewarded with much of its attention. About 4% of time spent with digital media is spent with news, all news combined, 4%. And of course, in many countries, there is a growing and deep crisis of confidence between much of the public and much of journalism. This, if you will, is a perfect storm. Elite pressures from many politicians, in some countries the government, technological developments that means that the market is turning its back on journalism because they can advertise and sell things more effectively using other means. And in some countries, the public turning its back on journalism with its attention, but also its confidence, if you will. I think if we want to think about what can be done about this, we have to sort of break with the dead hand of tradition and cease wondering about the journalism that we had and try to focus on the journalism that we want in the future. We have to be able to make a distinction between what we do because it's custom and what we do because it's mission. We have to think about the question of how journalism can move from simply providing people with information in the world in which there's so much information available, and ask the question instead how journalism can help people be informed. And finally, I think we have to think about the word publishing and whether there is a point at which journalists have to be as good as listening as they are at publishing. This, I think, is an opportunity to cut through the noise and ask the question not only of whether the public will trust journalism, but whether journalism in fact is trustworthy, and what journalism is trustworthy, when journalism is trustworthy. And in that way, perhaps again, become relevant and valuable to the public, to us as individual citizens, and perhaps valuable even in a way that can ensure the economic sustainability of a profession whose host institutions right now are existentially threatened commercially. There's not one way to do this, I think that is clear. In American journalism, for example, I think we can think of the people who say that we can become better journalists by focusing more on the classical virtues of what we do. I think of this as sort of the Steve Adler and Marty Baron view of the world, back to the classics. But there are also other voices, and I think equally legitimate voices that we should consider. These are the people who would say that journalists need to ask the question of who do we do it for? This is the view of, for example, Melissa Bell, the publisher of Vox, or Lydia Palgren, the editor-in-chief of HuffPost. No one believes that the journey ahead is easy, but I think the urgency of it we cannot underestimate, because the alternative to facing these very real, significant, and complex challenges is not simply that journalism may go quietly into the night. It is that journalism is reduced to a hollowed-out henchman of power and privilege, propped up by proprietors and political interests that subsidize news organizations and pay for journalists to do a version of their work to further their own interests and not to enable the public to make more informed decisions. I work with journalists from all over the world every day in my job at the Reuters Institute, and I tremendously admire and I'm inspired by the work that they do. But I also want to underline that we as a society have to confront the fact that individual effort, even individual heroism, is not an answer to institutional problems. We cannot rely solely on people's willingness to give their utmost and to sacrifice, make the kinds of sacrifices we've seen journalists make in recent years within Europe, and expect that this alone can enable the public to be informed to make the decisions about how to govern themselves. So we have to ask, I think, ourselves in this room and beyond this room, what does an enabling environment look like? What do we expect from our politicians? How can we think about their actions when they call imperfect but potentially valuable news fake news? What does our own role look like in the public? What can we do individually and collectively to support journalism? Is it perhaps worth paying for on occasion? And what can we do in this room in the sense that we represent civil society, ranging from advocacy organizations and NGOs to universities, to exert pressure on decision makers and ensure that they actually act out the ideals that they are happy to mention in after-dinner speeches about the importance of freedom of expression and journalism in free societies. I think that we all aspire to live in open societies, we also recognize, as Secretary Clinton said, that the precondition of these open societies enabling us to live the life that we want to live are robust institutions that empower us as individuals. We have to agree to disagree. We know we live in irreducibly diverse societies that are very disputatious. So this is not about agreeing on a common definition of the good life, but about what are the institutions that enable us to carry on a conversation about who we are, how we live together, and how we divide scarce resources. In that environment, shared access to reliable information, even if much of it is also opinionated commentary coming from different points of view, is a critically important thing. It is not democracy in itself, but it's an important part of democracy. And journalism, imperfect as it is, I think has proven itself to be the best available means of providing such information in a timely and accessible way for the public at large, rather than just people like us in this room. So I think in that sense, we know that liberalism needs journalism. And then if we recognize the political pressures that journalism is increasingly subject to around the world, I think we may also say perhaps that journalism needs liberalism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Rasmus. Nick.
So that's tees up very neatly the small story that I want to tell and the very preliminary set of strategies that I want to suggest for responding to this moment. Because clearly what we would have done in this room 20 years ago, or unfortunately even 5 or 10 years ago perhaps, is to talk about censorship, to talk about state propaganda, to talk about tools that can subvert it or strategies for resisting it. But from everything we've heard this morning, we have to talk about a much more complex and hybrid environment and a spectrum of environments that range between closed through fragile to open but challenged in various ways. We have to talk about the world of networked propaganda and of the very serious kinds of trust concerns, economic concerns and technology concerns that Rasmus alluded to. And think about what the human rights community's response and the journalism community's response to that looks like, and whether indeed they don't perhaps overlap more than we might have thought. As a newspaper editor in South Africa, a country with a very strong Bill of Rights and a young but powerful constitutional tradition, my colleagues and I experienced what I think were the early stages of pressure to push the system in a less open direction. And that pressure took the form mostly of litigation, pretty much all of which failed to constrain our publishing. Later, it began to take the form of legislation, most of which clearly wasn't going to stand the constitutional test, and so also stalled. And then finally, as the combination of economic and technology pressures on the industry grew, it quietly crept up on us that the ownership dimension of control was becoming the most prominent. So you had the sale of the country's biggest English language news group to essentially a political crony, and the development of what had been a public broadcaster finding its way into more and more of a party and state broadcaster. But nevertheless, the combination of this quite robust constitutional tradition and a media and civil society and public acceptance of that tradition really did help to keep the space pretty open and pretty dynamic. So even despite these compromises, journalism has played a key role in combating South Africa's drift toward illiberalism, and most strikingly in the recent case of the so-called Gupta leaks, which was the publishing of a huge trove of information by an investigative non-profit news outlet, which played a pretty crucial role in ending Jacob Zuma's presidency. Subsequently, I moved to India with all of the technological optimism that Timothy mentioned at the outset, and thought that, well, if one could combine technology change and these sorts of constitutional values that I understood to be shared between these two countries, you could begin to build on what was vibrant and powerful in the Indian journalism tradition, and in a small way contribute to its resilience in the face of some of these challenges. And what I found arriving just before the election, which saw the BJP take power and Narendra Modi become Prime Minister, was a harbinger, really, of the rise of the demagogic media complex that we now see playing out around the world. First, in the comments on the Hindustan Times news site, which were increasingly hate-filled and objectionable. Now, that's something we all are familiar with, but the scale and intensity of it and the apparent organized character of it was new. The harassment of journalists on social media with a level of vitriol and, again, organization was new. And the fact that despite the constitutional environment, challenges both in the lower courts and in the ownership structure of media meant that people's sense of confidence in the space that they occupied was gravely constrained. And the rise of some small digital news startups helped to provide alternative channels and gave good journalists places to work, but its ability to impact the larger narrative, at least initially, was limited. So what you had instead was hyper-nationalist, hyper-partisan television, hyper-nationalist and hyper-partisan digital media space, with trolls, both organized and self-motivated, filling much of the atmosphere, and a prime minister who preferred to cut out independent institutions of accountability and speak directly to the public on social media. And if you like, that's a schema for the demagogue's playbook of hybrid propaganda, and you see it in Russia or in Russia's foreign projection. You have RT, you have Sputnik, you have the Internet Research Agency. You see it in the US with Fox, with trolls and the president's Twitter feed. And so our strategies for confronting the challenge we face need to take account of that. They also need to take account of the fact that threats to journalists run a spectrum from digital harassment to murder, and that in many countries you have both crude and traditional controls on press activity and highly sophisticated digital controls of the kind that Timothy alluded to. So what might a response to some of those things look like? If you look at the slogans of Fox News and RT, they're both essentially media criticism slogans. So Fox News's slogan is fair and balanced, which implies that nobody else is. RT says question more. So their trust model is to diminish trust in everybody else. What might a trust model look like that has a more positive foundation? And it seems to me, on the basis of my own experience and some of the discussion that sprung up around startups elsewhere in the world, that if you really want to optimize for trust, you might think about optimizing for human rights. It might entail thinking about freedom of speech in a way that links deeply to socioeconomic rights and theorizing that. It might mean thinking about freedom of speech in a way that relates fundamentally to human dignity and to the health of the public sphere. And saying that the job is not to be partisan, but to assert a politics of rights. To not say that you're on people's side on the basis of shared economic or party political interests, but on the basis of a shared commitment to their rights. And I think building that approach to the journalistic mission and to trust offers huge potential, and we can talk a bit more about that. I think you need deep and diverse range of economic models which enable us to combat the combination of crony ownership, state ownership, and very narrow economic interest that are driving so many problems that we face right now. And that might mean non-profit ownership, it might mean private ownership, it might mean public funding, not only for broadcasters, but for other media initiatives. It might mean thinking about the positive obligations of states in relation to speech and information rights and building a healthy information environment. It means building a rights-respecting approach to platform regulation and technology. one which doesn't simply impose crude and dangerous techno-pessimist fake news laws, which anyone who's lived in a country that has laws against spreading fear and panic or laws against insults will know are going to result in the shutdown of anything uncomfortable, but building truly rights-respecting approaches to platform regulation and also to the platform's terms of service, because regulation won't apply in all cases. So that's a task for this community, I think, to engage very robustly and thoughtfully both in the regulatory conversation and in the terms of service conversation with the platforms on the one hand and with news organizations on the other. And I think at the nexus of these three sorts of commitments maybe is the beginning of a set of strategies that addresses the trust dimension, the economic dimension, and the very necessary institutional and regulatory challenges that we face right now. And the last thing I'll say is that I think that I now work for a large global human rights organization. The idea that fact verification, investigation, and publishing lives only in the space of journalism traditionally conceived is probably more or less over. We, for example, did much of the foundational research that revealed the existence of the Uyghur gulags in China. We were able to work in places like Sinai in Egypt and to document torture in Egyptian prisons, or to cover extrajudicial killings in Rwanda. Very few news organizations are able to commit resources to that kind of work right now. But an investigative practice with accuracy, nonpartisanship, and rights orientation at its core is able to do that work and contribute it to the ecosystem. We want to do more of that, be better at it, and more effective at it. So everything that I've said about journalism applies to us too.
Thank you very much, Nick, so much.
Well, whenever I go out for assignments, when I have to list out a set of instructions for my parents and my family about how to get my body back, or in certain cases, how to, what to do if my body is not traceable. In the last 1.5 decade of my career, I've had several situations, faced, life-threatening situations, where I've lived in a room without electricity, in total darkness, with plastic pots in the name of toilet, apprehended by armed forces, armed extremists, both leftist and fundamentalists. My house has been attacked, for which I have had to shift cities. I've been attacked by mob. I was a part of a group of 25 reporters who were attacked by a mob of 400 angry young men. So I have kind of, seen it all, the kind of situation that we work and the kind of risks that we face. But what I'm really concerned about is now it has become even easier to kill me, because if the government doesn't want me to cover something, they will just circulate my photograph on WhatsApp and say, I'm a child kidnapper, or perhaps I'm, somebody, and I could be lynched to death. So that's how the situation in India is. It's really serious. It's really threatening for us. Why must I be killed? Because our government seriously don't, they don't want certain kind of news to be out, and for that, a lot of strategies are in place. For example, in March 2018, there was a Cobra Post investigation called 136, Operation 136, which exposed how 40 news organizations were ready to, churn out content. And I would like to quote really how about 40 prominent news organizations were willing to not only cause communal disharmony among citizens, but also tilt the electoral outcome in favor of a particular party for a prize. And these 40 news organizations included Hindustan Times, Times of India, India Today, Dainik Bhaskar Post, which are strangely, even when the print circulations are going down and print is making losses, these organizations are actually making profit in print, and we know how now. Then adding to the culture of misinformation and disinformation are those dubious websites, which if you trace their address, you'll find, they are housed in some small alley, somewhere in a small city, and are funded by the political parties. And all these rumors are spread through WhatsApp, because WhatsApp is supposed to be your friend. If a person who doesn't have a lot of media literacy is receiving a message, saying UNESCO has declared Narendra Modi the best prime minister in the world, somebody will certainly believe it. It is good news, for a lot of Indians who are, struggling in their own personal lives. So, we heard about Gauri Lankesh being killed. She was a very prominent rights activist, a very vocal journalist, always struggled for press freedom, but we don't really hear about 20 other reporters who were killed in the same year because they were working on a scam, a government-sponsored scam. And we don't hear about them because they are not very popular. They work in small villages for very less known small media outlets. So they are killed in road accidents, staged road accidents, or they are killed in armed ambush, and nobody really talks about them. When, something like Cobra Post happens, Operation 136, the sting operation in the 40 newsrooms, the first response of these newspapers or these media establishments were defamation suits, which fell apart later on. They could not stand. And the second, second formula taken by them is a personal attack, or a kind of attack on the reputation of the reporters or the journalists. Now, when you spread rumor about somebody's personal life, or how somebody's personal conduct is, because of the kind of stories, these rumors are very difficult to die down. And this is something I've personally experienced, because the last mainstream newspaper or the media organization I worked for, we were a part of a 5-member special investigation team. And over the period of months, when I came to know that the sensitive documents that we were getting for news was misused, and were used by the management to broker deals, business deals, all of us quit. And since I was the first one to inform my team members, because my source informed me, the same source who had given me the document, informed me that, the documents that I gave you are being now used to blackmail my organization. I was branded, I quit, and it was a kind of the vilification campaigns that started against me, and then the peer pressure, because your colleagues don't want to talk to somebody or associated with somebody who has that kind of a reputation. So even if I got the CEO to apologize, but misinformation, the rumors are circulated at a wide scale, but apologies are given very discreetly. I don't know whether anybody has heard about Rana Ayub, my colleague in India, a journalist whose face was morphed on a pornographic clip, and it was circulated just because she wrote, she reported widely on the Godhra riots, in which our Prime Minister had a very large role. In the Cobra Post reporters, the same kind of misinformation was being circulated against the Cobra Post reporter, the investigative reporters who went to every newsroom and actually did the sting operation. So, after having seen so much, and after having completely come out of the system, I consider myself a rogue reporter, because I have come out of the system completely. And since I have nothing to lose now, I've started my own website called Reporter at Large. It's a non-profit website. We do not take advertisements. It's not under a paywall. The content is completely free. We do not take funds from any political party or any business house in India. We cannot take international funds anyway, because our Prime Minister has this FRCA rule in place which restricts foreign funding to Indian organizations. And we are very frugal. And since we are small and very humble and frugal, and we do very careful budgeting, so we are actually able to reach out to a lot of places where mainstream newspapers are not reaching out to. For example, to do a very good quality reporting, it's just £50. It costs a mere £50. In India, it's a lot of money. £50 is a lot of money. And it can actually fund 2 good stories, which needs to be reported. So, when my colleagues, all my colleagues who are still working in the mainstream media, they come and in the evening when we let some steam out together, and we talk about what is happening in our newsrooms, and everybody's frustrated. So, Reporter at Large gives an opportunity to reporters to publish stories that are rejected in the newsrooms because of non-journalistic reasons. Because the management won't publish those stories because they have, certain kind of tilt to certain political party. What we are also trying to do, I've also formed a non-profit organization called Turya Foundation, under which Reporter at Large is registered. So we have a 3-step formula to every problem. The first is carry out academic studies, scientific studies, through the non-profit organization. And I'll give you an example. For example, in a tea garden, if there are banned pesticides being used, there is a proper study taking water sample from the rivers, from the streams, and calculating how much, finding out the entire science behind it. The second step is starting a public discourse through Reporter at Large, when we report and we write about these things. And the third step is getting the lawyers involved and filing public interest litigations. So whatever we do, in a holistic way, in a complete way, we complement each other and bring real change on the ground. Optimism is the only thing that we can hope for. We have to go on and on and on. We can't quit. And even so, now in this kind of a scenario where all over in every country, across the world, independent voices are being suppressed. So that's the only thing we can do right now, be optimistic and just keep going whatever we are doing.
Thank you very much so much. A great report from a rogue reporter. Ezgi.
Thank you, Tim. All the critical junctures in Turkey's illiberal turn and the ruling party's crackdown on media unfortunately impacted my career and my story as a journalist. I want to start with how it operates. How a illiberal regime, I would like to call a competitive authoritarian regime, that would suit it more, operates, so that I believe reminding and knowing these steps is crucial to resist it. On the contrary to the widespread belief in the Western media, the decline of democracy and the crackdown on media in Turkey did not start in 2016 with the botched coup. It goes way back, almost a decade. And after President Erdogan consolidated its power around 2010, it started doing 4 things. Well, actually, it started before that, but after 2010, it picked up great speed. The first vein was taking over media outlets, like Tim said, which is in the case of Orban. When AKP came to power in 2006, pro-AKP news outlets consisted of 20% of the mainstream media. Since then, AKP used legal loopholes, amended laws, and set what I call a confiscate and sell mechanism to change the media landscape in its favor. Now, literally, all the mainstream media is owned by pro-government companies. And the second vein was putting financial burden on media outlets who are critical of the government. For example, in 2008, a 2.7 billion tax fine was imposed on my newspaper, Hürriyet, shortly after Hürriyet published a corruption case story that showed deep ties into the AKP government. The third vein is cutting the financial life cord of media outlets. For example, in 2014, the official advertisement agency stopped awarding ads to certain media outlets without any legal justification. And now it has become a de facto situation that no significant major company dare to put ads in a in a news outlet that is not owned or controlled by AKP government. And the fourth one is the least sophisticated and most obvious one, is imprisoning a journalist. And again, it did not start with the botched coup attempt, but it started with two big cases that emerged in 2010, which claim that there is a deep state apparatus and journalists are being part of that media structure. Even though these trials are now being acknowledged as sham trials due to the fact that AKP had a strife with its then ally Fethullah Gülen movement. But the jailing of journalists unfortunately persists, and the number changes weekly, on a weekly basis. Right now, the number is 73, which makes Turkey the biggest jailer of journalists in Turkey. And according to CPJ, Turkey had jailed more journalists than any other country in the last 25 years. So considering I'm a journalist for 15 years, I have never seen a good day in my entire career. Yeah, I started working as an intern at Hürriyet, and then 8 years later I had become the youngest editor-in-chief of Radikal newspaper, which is well known with its coverage of minority rights, human rights abuses, and especially the Kurdish issue. And this is actually the expertise, and which made me really unpopular in the eyes of the government. Our coverage in Radikal during the Gezi protests and after the collapse of the recent Kurdish peace process become a bit annoying in the eyes of the government, because we were not marching to the official statements, we were not nationalistic, we were not on any on one side, and we were just trying to unearth the truth, which is basically the definition of journalism. But I was being given warnings from different channels, and one of them said, exactly, quote unquote, when your name and the newspaper of your name is brought up in Ankara, their eyebrows raise. So, and at the same time, I was being harassed by pro-government columnists weekly, being threatened and lynched over social media. And after I was being offered police protection by the government, I knew what that means in the Turkish context. You're either going to end up dead, and the government would say, oh, we were protecting this person, or it's just a harassment tale. I think in my case it was the latter. I don't think I was, I shouldn't say never, but I knew that I had to have a break from the newsroom. And my husband, who had done all his law studies at Oxford, this was the only safest place he knew that we could come. We thought it would be just for a couple of months until everything was okay. But then the coup attempt came, and then and the Syrian crisis escalated, which made the Kurdish issue and my position a bit more unpopular. So I couldn't go back. And there is a serious tragedy for even those. I feel myself really lucky to, and I call St. Anthony's, my college, as my second home right now. I'm really happy and lucky to have not been arrested, like many of my colleagues. But there's a serious tragedy behind even for those one that managed to exit an illiberal regime, because you cannot half exit. you need to burn your bridges. If you have family there, if you have friends there, if you want to see your mom or protect your 4-year-old son, you need to keep yourself, keep a low profile and pull yourself from the public debate in your own country. So, which makes it a bit embarrassing for a journalist, because you see a domesticated, a tamed version of yourself and ask yourself, have I become the person that the Turkish government wanted me to be? So, and I'm not saying that I'm not doing research for Oxford University, but I'm not doing my job. And doing my job is really essential to keep the democracies, to have a democratic pillar. And what we can do is to have, again, solidarity networks beyond the renowned, NGOs, because now these NGOs, unfortunately, in countries like Turkey, become tools of saying like, oh, the Western conspiracy is plotting against us, trying to topple the government. So we need to find a solidarity network, a non-hierarchical, flat network that would require no journalist to be formally member, but everyone, all journalists to be de facto members. And it could operate and start and kickstart with something like Me Too campaign. Secondly, we need to have funding. And, I don't know, because I know that Timothy would not agree with me, but the only viable model to me right now, until we find a solution to handle the digital revolution, is a BBC model. I know you're mad at them because of their coverage during the Brexit, but the paywalls and subscription model does not work in countries like Turkey. And I have spent my, I used to spend half of my day in the newsroom trying to handle an illiberal government and also acting supranational giants like Google and algorithm, and trying to defeat their, algorithm, so that not the stories about Kim Kardashian, but human rights abuses can, can be disseminated to greater crowds. And thirdly, we need to make some criticism, like self-criticism, like Rasmus said. There has to be a reason why journalists all around the world have become untrustworthy. It's beyond the rhetoric of illiberal leaders. Illiberal leaders are portraying us journalists as part of the elite establishment. To be perfectly honest, I have never seen a journalist, a reporter, gaining enough money to make ends in any country, seriously. And now we are being part of the elites, and the ones who are portraying us are unfortunately billionaires like Trump and Nigel Farage. This is the irony. But we need to do self-criticism and look into the way how the relational structures that some of our colleagues had done with the power holders, and we need to redefine and underline that we're here not for power, not for profit, but for public good.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we've had 4 really excellent and compelling presentations. By the way, I think if you have a genuine public service broadcaster like the BBC, you should hang on to it for dear life and double the budget. That's
Yes.
what I actually think.
Yes.
I think that's part of the answer. I want to give the panel a chance to respond to each other, and if I may throw in 3 questions that arise from what you all said. First of all, let's say a bit more about how we go up against this really corrosive problem of hidden control through ownership, including government advertising. Nick, you mentioned the mix, and it clearly has to be a mix. There has to be the private, not-for-profit, citizen journalism, and so on. But I would like you to say more about the not-for-profit bit of this, because I think foundation funding has to be part of the mix, particularly for serious investigative reporting and foreign reporting. The motto of some of you will know of The Guardian's comment is free pages is comment is free but facts are sacred. But we now vary that to say comment is free but facts are expensive, right? And facts are expensive, and so I think that has to be part of the mix. Secondly, I think what Soma said is so important about WhatsApp. I spent much of last week talking to people at Facebook about what they're trying to do to clean up their act, and actually they're doing quite a lot on Facebook. More detailed community standards, more transparency, appeals procedure, trying to do something about fake news and so on. But they also own WhatsApp. And they said, we have absolutely no idea what is being said on WhatsApp because it's encrypted end to end. That's the principle. So all this explosive, I mean, you're being threatened with death on WhatsApp, and the people who own WhatsApp have absolutely no idea what is being said. So how do we think about this actually new generation of the internet, encrypted end to end, which from the point of view of privacy as a human right is obviously a very good thing. The third question I wanted to throw in is about how sort of high-end quality media respond to the advent of populist demagogues and what you wonderfully called, Nick, the demagogic media complex. I like that. Example, the New York Times. For 100 years, the New York Times was called the Grey Lady, and it had an unbelievably scrupulous division between news and opinion, and the news coverage was, I mean, impartial to a Puritan extreme, went to extraordinary lengths not to use any judgmental adjective. This lasted until sometime in 2016, when suddenly seeing Trump coming down the road, which they hadn't foreseen, the New York Times essentially became a campaigning newspaper. And the coverage changed, and the news coverage called him a liar and started using these judgmental adjectives. And it's actually remained to this day. It's still, essentially, it is a campaigning anti-Trump newspaper. It's changed its model. It's like La Repubblica faced with Berlusconi in Italy. And I can totally understand why it's done that, absolutely understand it, but I worry about it. I worry about the loss of places which really do have due impartiality, like the BBC, places that people from all sides of the political spectrum can come to hear voices from all sides of the political spectrum. So I wonder if any of you would like to comment on that in particular. Who would like to kick off? Soma.
I would like to, say a couple of things about WhatsApp. I don't think we shouldn't believe a single thing that WhatsApp and Facebook says.
Totally
Because 256-bit encryption that they are providing, which in the terms and conditions of WhatsApp, and it's all online, you can read it up, in a very complex language, is that a third party can access it. So what's the point of having encryption if a third party accesses it? So it's all, it's like a joke. So we shouldn't be believing WhatsApp and Facebook at all. Our data is being compromised. It is being accessed, by Facebook every day. So when you come across news items, when Pakistan is inviting Facebook to collaborate with them and signing memorandum of understanding to stop blasphemy in their country, my question is how? How is Facebook going to stop blasphemy in Pakistan? Just think about the ways,
Can I also say something about, it's not only about data, it's also how Facebook and Google are sometimes negotiating with the illiberal regimes. For example, 10 years ago, I had interviewed a Facebook executive, and he blatantly said that they are doing, they are censoring certain images or they are closing down certain pages that are quote unquote against the Turkish government. But I showed them that there are graphic images of Turkish soldiers going into southeast Turkey and proudly showing those pictures, which is against the Facebook, you know, against everything. So I don't think we should take what they say for granted. They are complicit with the illiberal regimes in many, many countries. They, like you said, they are not really helping with the free speech at the moment.
Nick, well,
I think obviously we're at the very beginning of the conversation about how platforms play and what role they play, supportive, destructive, in between. And encryption adds a layer of real complexity to that. There are signals that WhatsApp have in the metadata which don't involve breaking encryption, and that could trigger responses if they thought of themselves as responsible actors. There are also design features both in encrypted platforms like WhatsApp and design features in open platforms like Twitter or semi-open platforms like Instagram or Facebook, which optimize for the worst behavior, which see high levels of engagement that are generated by polarizing material and rewarded with more dopamine. Hashtag auto-discovery. For example, during the Rohingya crisis, I remember going on Twitter and starting to type in ROH into the search tag, and all of the responses that came back, conveniently to help me find the community that I wanted to find, were either Indian right-wing groups, Rohingyas destroy India, Rohingyas are terrorists, or Buddhist nationalists in Myanmar. So that's a design feature that someone came up with to be innocently helpful, which optimizes for hate. So there are conversations that you can have that are not about breaking encryption and that are not necessarily about strong negative controls, that are about design and how design optimizes for anti-rights and anti-journalism outcomes. And I think the conversation at the moment is still a bit crude and initial, and we have a lot of work to do. And there are things that the tech platforms can learn from human rights lawyers, which is a surprise to them because they arrived to save the world from Silicon Valley. And there are a few hundred years of thinking about these things that might be relevant. So that's one thing. Just very quickly on your question about campaigning media, I think that when basic democratic norms are politicized, when the idea of journalism is politicized, question more, fair and balanced, then you have to have a politics of accountability. You have to have a politics of democracy. You have to have a politics of rights. And if that means that traditionally grey newspapers become more aligned, I think that's just natural in a sense. Because the New York Times was derided as liberal by Fox News before the advent of Trump. What will be concerning is if in the next administration, the New York Times still doesn't pay any attention to water in Flint, Michigan, or to drone strikes that are encouraged by a Democratic administration. So long as they stay true to that core set of standards and norms and values that they are now more comfortable advocating for, then I think we'll be okay.
I mean, I think, we started this morning with the big historical sweep and Secretary Clinton talking about 1948 and where we were then and where we got to since. If we want to adopt that analogy, I think we are not in 1948 now, we are in 1940 in the war for the future of journalism. Some of the mighty have fallen, others still stand, and much is still to be resolved, and it can go either way. And I think if we think about that analogy, if you will, it's for those who believe in journalism the way that Eski and Soma talk about their commitment at an individual level, that the first commitment is to truth. Find truth and report it, and make that available and accessible for the public. I think it's really important, as you suggest, that we also recognize that no one is going to save that vision of journalism on its behalf. Platforms are not going to do it. They may well evolve a more constructive relationship with journalism, but they will not on their own save journalism. It's absolutely crystal clear that elected officials will not save journalism. We probably shouldn't want that in many countries around the world, but even in the countries where we might believe on balance that political intervention could be benign, we should seek that benign intervention, but the idea that politicians on their own alone can save journalism, fever dream. And I think at this moment, we can't expect that the public will step in immediately, right? Because the threads that connect journalism with the public are really thin and fraying in many countries, even in the ones in which journalism has the most to be proud of. The share of attention is small and shrinking. The confidence, the trust, the sense of value is limited. And there are people who have had enough, are turning their back on journalism. So I think it's a moment to think about, if we accept that this is a dark moment and there are powerful actors out there who wish journalism ill at worst and at best are, benignly indifferent to it, what can journalism itself do? And I think it is a moment for a critical self-reflection, and as you suggest, also and recognition. The public knows that journalism is at best imperfect and at worst pernicious. So we have to fess up to that. And there has been an ethos of solidarity amongst journalists and the news industry in many countries. This has not been recognized. There's not been a willingness to have the kind of public conversation about the shortcomings of a powerful institution and a powerful profession that journalism imposes on other powerful professions and other powerful institutions in society. I mean, that's called hypocrisy. And that's not a great starting point if you want to regain the public's confidence. So I think it might behoove us to recognize that in many cases and in many countries, journalism has been drunk on profit from advertising revenues. It really had very little to do with editorial. It was an accident largely that they happened to control the means of accessing the audience. Drunk on power, on being the gatekeepers between the public and powerful individuals. That meant that they had access, and they were drunk on this access to the assumption that self-interested, powerful individuals and institutions would somehow subject themselves to scrutiny. That was not an ideal commitment. They did it because they needed the connection with the audience that only journalists and news organizations could provide. That is no longer the case, so of course they do not subject themselves to that kind of scrutiny anymore. And as some of us will have experienced in our own life, when you've been drunk for a long time, there's sort of a question, what do you do next? Is that the hunt for the next drink to sort of keep you running on an empty tank, just extend it for a little while longer until whatever lies at the end of that route? Or is it a moment of reflection where you think about, is it maybe time for something else, right? And I have to say that it's tremendously inspiring to hear about the things that Soma and Eski and many others are doing. And I think this is a moment in which journalism in the Western world, who have enjoyed the privileges I just described and perhaps been intoxicated by them for longer, can think about what it means to practice journalism and to build institutions that can sustain journalism when you do not have those privileges. There is amazing journalism done all over the world every day by people who operate under circumstances that we cannot even imagine, most of us in this room. And they are making a very real difference. And I think it's a chance, if you will, to try to think about, what would that look like in our societies when it's not about having hundreds of journalists in a large, expensive building centrally placed in a capital, but about what can you do if you start from the point of view of the mission. And I think we're seeing really encouraging examples of this in India, and in Turkey too, under very difficult circumstances, but also increasingly in the Western world, by learning from people like you.
Thank you, Rasmus. I have to say, someone who's worked in journalism on and off for 40 years, the metaphor of recovering alcoholics works on many levels.